This is killing me. I don't.
Breaking news coming from SoFi Stadium, where The Weeknd abruptly stopped his concert tonight.
For over a decade, The Weeknd has been an icon of global pop culture, the voice of hedonism, heartbreak, and fame. But in May 2023, without warning, the world's most streamed artist said something that froze the internet.
So when did the decision to kind of retire The Weeknd, when did that come?
That kind of helped it.
Yeah.
Within hours, headlines erupted, fans panicked, and critics whispered, "Was this confession or prophecy? Is this the sound of a man breaking apart or breaking free? And if The Weeknd dies, who does Abel Tesfaye become?" Because maybe this isn't a collapse at all. Maybe it's the final act of a story he's been writing from the very beginning. This is the rise, the reign, and the self-destruction of The Weeknd. For more than a decade, The Weeknd had been an untouchable brand, a rare blend of mystery, mastery, and myth. But in 2023, that illusion shattered. The brand that once defined perfection in pop suddenly collapsed under the weight of its own ambition. It began with The Idol. The HBO series was meant to be Abel Tesfaye's next great transformation, a dark mirror reflecting the toxic machinery of fame. Instead, it became the very thing it tried to criticize. Months before the show even aired, a Rolling Stone expose detonated like a bomb. Reports of chaos behind the scenes, a gutted female perspective, and a creative overhaul that turned the project into what crew members allegedly called torture porn and a fantasy. The public was stunned. Not because The Weeknd was controversial, but because the controversy now seemed out of his control. Tesfaye's reaction only deepened the damage. In a now infamous tweet, he mocked Rolling Stone as irrelevant, attaching a clip from the series to prove his point. The move backfired instantly. What was intended as confidence read as arrogance, the very opposite of the detached cool that once defined him. When The Idol finally premiered, the verdict was unanimous. The Guardian called it empty, joyless, and grotesque. Forbes dubbed it the worst-reviewed show in HBO history. Variety dismissed it as regressive rather than provocative. Viewers described it as painfully dull, exploitative, and a mess. On Rotten Tomatoes, critics scored it a meager 22%. The show, which was supposed to expose the moral rot of celebrity culture, became its own exhibit, a grotesque reflection of excess without meaning. In a single summer, the cultural balance shifted. The Weeknd, once the puppet master of his own myth, became the target of it. What had started as a satire of power dynamics now made him appear complicit in the very abuse it portrayed. The character he played on screen, Tedros, wasn't just a villain. He was a distortion of The Weeknd's public persona, one that audiences could no longer separate from the man himself. The irony was brutal. The artist who once controlled every frame of his image had finally lost control of the narrative. And how more ironic is it that just 2 years before The Idol collapsed in flames, The Weeknd still stood on the world's biggest stage, the 2021 Super Bowl halftime show, alone, commanding a universe of light. Every detail shimmered with control. The red suit, the mirrored corridors, the endless cityscape of dancers wrapped in bandages. It wasn't just a concert, it was a coronation. The Weeknd had done what few artists ever could, turned his pain into a global religion. At that moment, he was untouchable. Blinding Lights had become the most streamed song in history. His albums dominated charts across continents, and his persona, half martyr, half machine, had swallowed pop culture whole. The same darkness that once made him mysterious now made him magnetic. The lonely boy from Toronto had built an empire out of heartbreak, excess, and design. But beneath that empire, the first crack had already formed, and it began long before the lights went out on the SoFi stage. And back in 2011, there was no fame, no spectacle, only Abel Tesfaye, a kid who ran away from home with nothing but a dream and a broken voice. He recorded in silence, uploaded songs without a face, and built a legend out of anonymity. The first 3 mixtapes, House of Balloons, Thursday, Echoes of Silence, felt like confessions left on an answering machine. The world fell in love with that voice because it not only felt real, but also a real one. And then when the trilogy dropped, he became the faceless savior of a new R&B, cinematic, dark, and addictive. Drake's cosign pulled him into the spotlight, and suddenly the ghost had a name. By 2015, with Beauty Behind the Madness and Starboy, The Weeknd was no longer running from fame. He was shaping it. The underground loner had turned into a brand of precision. The shadows became neon, the chaos became choreography. But somewhere in that metamorphosis, something essential was wrong. The mystery that once shielded him became a mask he couldn't remove. The man who once avoided cameras now couldn't escape them. The stage that once symbolized freedom began to feel like a trap. That's the irony, since the same aesthetic that built his kingdom. The gimmick of the bloodied face, of the self-inflicted wounds, the lonely anti-hero bathed in red, became the prophecy of his undoing. Not After Hours, which, The Weeknd's greatest masterpiece, is not just an album about heartbreak. It is exactly a funeral in disguise. Even as the world sang along to blinding lights, the artist was already writing his own eulogy. So when the idol finally imploded, it didn't come as a rupture. It was the echo of something that had cracked years earlier. The man who once controlled every image had been showing us a signal that Abel Tesfaye is no longer being The Weeknd. But the world wasn't ready to let go. What began as an artistic shift quickly turned into a cultural freefall. The brand that once defined pop perfection started to decay in plain sight. Streams slowed, reviews soured, and the same audience that once worshipped his detachment now called it emptiness. The red suit disappeared from stages, endorsements faded. Even the press stopped asking about music. They asked about identity. For an artist who once commanded every spotlight, invisibility became the cruelest fate of all. This wasn't cancellation, it was erosion. A slow, silent unraveling of everything that once made The Weeknd untouchable. And when the myth finally collapsed, it left behind only a man, standing in the wreckage of a name too heavy to carry any longer. Every downfall has its surface story, the scandal, the failure, the moment the world turns away. But beneath the idol's humiliation and the Sophie breakdown lay something deeper. The slow disintegration of a man trapped inside his own creation. The Weeknd didn't collapse because of one mistake. He collapsed because the world stopped believing in the myth. For years, Abel Tesfaye built The Weeknd as a character that thrived on control, meticulously curated, emotionally distant, and perfectly designed to embody both mystery and power. But that design eventually became its flaw. The more flawless the brand became, the less human it felt. Fans once drawn to his raw vulnerability now saw only a polished performance, one that no longer reflected truth, only repetition. What once felt like confession had turned into choreography. The culture had also shifted beneath him. In an age moving toward authenticity, imperfection, and transparency, The Weeknd represented the last gasp of a bygone era, the era of the untouchable idol. His cold cinematic detachment clashed with a generation that now preferred emotional realism over artistic mystique. While artists like Billie Eilish and Kendrick Lamar exposed their flaws, Tesfaye kept hiding behind glass. The distance that once elevated him now alienated him. At the same time, success became its own trap. The Weeknd had achieved everything measurable. The most streamed artist in the world, record-breaking singles, a Super Bowl performance. There was nowhere higher to climb. And when there is no ascent left, the only remaining narrative is descent. For an artist obsessed with reinvention, the greatest enemy wasn't failure. It was stillness. But perhaps the most personal fracture came from within. The character that once protected Abel, the hedonistic shadow through which he processed pain, had grown too far from who he had become. The Weeknd no longer served him, it consumed him. The luxury, the decadence, the artificial chaos, all of it had become theater. And the man behind the mask was suffocating beneath the act. So when Abel Tesfaye announced that he wanted to kill The Weeknd, it wasn't a shock. It was a confession. A man finally admitting that the illusion he'd created to survive had become the very thing destroying him. The fall, in truth, wasn't a failure. It was an escape disguised as one. The disappearance of The Weeknd has sparked endless speculation. Was it truly the death of a persona, or the birth of something new? When a brand this powerful vanishes, it rarely happens by accident. One theory suggests it was a controlled demolition, a masterclass in brand management disguised as self-destruction. By killing The Weeknd at his peak, Abel Tesfaye preserved the legacy before it could decay. In a culture where artists are consumed and discarded, stepping away on his own terms allowed him to exit the myth before it turned on him. This isn't collapse, it's curation. Another theory views the disappearance as a calculated metamorphosis. Tesfaye's retreat may be the foundation for his next act, not as a performer, but as an architect. He has already hinted at producing, acting, and creating new visual worlds. Perhaps Abel Tesfaye is the evolution, a quieter, more authentic identity that no longer needs spectacle to command attention. Then there's a darker possibility, that the Weeknd was never meant to last. From the start, the persona was built on decay, heartbreak, addiction, and disillusionment. The story always ended in self-destruction. It just took a decade to catch up. Maybe the collapse wasn't a twist, but the logical final scene of the narrative he'd been writing all along. Whichever theory you believe, one thing is clear. This disappearance was not silence. It was design. Because in the world Abel Tesfaye created, even an ending can sound like a perfectly composed outro. The story of the Weeknd is not one of scandal or ruin, but of transformation, a modern parable about what happens when art and identity become indistinguishable. Abel Tesfaye built one of the most powerful personas in contemporary music, then did the unthinkable. He walked away from it. In an era where fame demands permanence, he chose disappearance. His journey exposes the quiet truth beneath modern celebrity, that perfection once achieved becomes a cage. The more complete the myth, the less room there is for the human behind it to breathe. The Weeknd was never just a brand. It was a mirror reflecting everything the world wanted from him. Mystery, danger, desire. And like all mirrors, it eventually shattered. Now, as Abel Tesfaye stands outside the empire he created, the question remains, can an artist ever escape their own invention? Or does every myth, no matter how deliberately destroyed, live on in the shadows of the person who made it? In the end, the fall of the Weeknd isn't just about fame. It's about freedom. And sometimes, to be free, you have to let the whole world think you've disappeared.